The medical bay was quiet, except for the soft hum of diagnostic equipment and the occasional beep of monitoring systems. Yuna lay on a treatment bed while a Meridian physician worked on her injuries, and her squad mates stood nearby watching with a mixture of concern and barely contained pride. The physician clicked his mandibles in what Yuna had learned was an expression of professional admiration. He said she had a fractured collarbone and 3 cracked ribs and severe bruising across 40% of her body and mild internal bleeding that he had already addressed by any reasonable standard. She should have collapsed long before the match ended. Yuna said she would take that as a compliment. The physician made a sound that might have been a laugh and continued his work. The door opened, and Ambassador Choi entered with tears still visible on her face. She walked to Yuna's bedside and took her hand, and for a long moment she could not speak. Finally, she said that what Yuna had done today had changed everything. Yuna asked what she meant. The ambassador explained that diplomatic channels were already flooding with messages about the match species that had dismissed humanity as weak and irrelevant were now requesting meetings. Trade negotiations that had stalled for months were suddenly moving forward. The Krovar Empire itself had sent a formal communication expressing respect for human warriors too. Years of diplomatic work had been accomplished in 23 minutes. Yuna said she was just trying not to lose. The ambassador smiled and said sometimes that was all anyone could do. Outside the medical bay, the news of Yuna's victory was spreading across the station and beyond. In the mess hall, cadets from dozens of species watched the replay on every screen, and they studied every moment of the match, trying to understand what they had witnessed. The Krovar cadets, who had laughed 3 days ago, now sat in silence. Their champion had been defeated, and the universe no longer made sense. A young Velani cadet approached the human table, where Dowan and Mira and Taiwan sat eating. He asked if he could join them, and they looked at each other in surprise before gesturing for him to sit. The Velani said he had bet against Yuna like everyone else, and he had lost a significant amount of credits, but watching the match he realized he had won something more valuable. He had learned that he had fundamentally misunderstood what made a species dangaroos. Duan asked what he meant. The Velani explained that his people measured threat by size and strength and technological advancement. Humans scored poorly on all these metrics, but none of those metrics accounted for what he had seen in the arena. He asked what you called a species that simply would not stop no matter what you did to them. Taiwan smiled and said you called them survivors. Across the station, in a private recovery room, Thorax Vulcan lay on a bed designed for his massive frame. His body was not injured because Yuna had never truly attacked him. His body had simply failed, and that was far more difficult to accept. His father, the Krovar general, entered the room and stood over him with an expression of profound disappointment. The general said that Thorax had brought shame upon their family and their people, and that to be defeated by such a weak opponent was unforgivable. Thrax looked at his father and said something that surprised them both. He said Yuna Park was not weak. The general demanded to know what he was talking about and pointed out that the human was tiny and fragile and posed no threat in direct combat. Thorax sat up slowly and explained what he had learned in those 23 minutes. He said the human could not match his strength and could not match his speed and could not match his durability, but she possessed something he did not have. She possessed the ability to endure beyond all reasonable limits. She had taken blows that should have broken her, and she had kept moving. She had pushed her body past the point of failure, and she had kept moving. She had faced certain defeat against an opponent who had never lost, and she had kept moving. That was not weakness. That was a kind of strength the Krovar had never developed. The general was silent for a long moment, and then he left without another word. In the days that followed, the story of the match spread beyond. Varanthos Primate traveled along trade routes and communication relays and diplomatic channels. It reached worlds that had never heard of humanity, and worlds that had dismissed humans as irrelevant. Everywhere it went, it carried the same message: humans were not to be underestimated on Earth. The match became the most watched piece of media in human history. Billions of people watched Una Park outlast the undefeated champion, and they saw themselves in her struggle. They saw their ancestors who had survived ice ages and plagues and wars. They saw the fundamental human refusal to surrender. They saw what made them human. 1 week after the tournament, Una returned to training despite her injuries. Her squad mates found her on the running track, moving slowly but steadily around the station perimeter. Dawn jogged alongside her and asked if she should be resting. Una said she had rested enough and that the tournament was not over. She had won the first round, but there were more matches ahead, more opponents who would need to learn what humans were capable of. Myra caught up to them and asked if Una was not satisfied with what she had accomplished. Una considered the question and then shook her head. She said the victory was important, but it was only the beginning. Humanity had been given a seat at the galactic table, but they had not yet earned their place. That would take more than one match. That would take generations of humans proving themselves over and over, but that was fine because patience and persistence were what humans did best. They ran together around the track, and the station hummed with activity. Around them, somewhere out there, the galaxy was watching and waiting to see what humanity would do. Next, Una smiled and picked up her pace. She had spent her whole life preparing for moments like this, and she was just getting started in the arena. Observation box. A recording of the match played on loop for a group of academy instructors. Instructor Valis Tarn watched with her compound eyes, missing nothing. A Tarathi combat master beside her asked what she thought now about the human cadet. Valis made a gesture of acknowledgement with all 4 arms. She said she had asked Una before the match whether she was wise or foolish now. She had her answer: the human was neither. She was something far more dangerous. She was determined, and in a galaxy full of powerful species and advanced civilizations and ancient empires, sometimes determination was the most terrifying thing of all. 15 minutes into the match, and the arena had transformed into something no one present had ever experienced. The roaring crowd had become completely silent, and 15,000 spectators watched with disbelief as the greatest warrior of his generation struggled to stand. Thorax Vulcan was a monument to Crovar superiority, and he had never known defeat, and he had never known weakness, and he had never known what it felt like when his body refused to obey his commands. Now, he knew all of these things. His legs trembled with each step, and his arms hung heavy at his sides, and his lungs burned with every desperate breath. Across from him, Una Park continued to circle, and her movement had not stopped since the match began. She was hurt and exhausted, and her body was covered in bruises from the glancing blows she had absorbed. But she was still moving. The Crovar were engineered for combat, and their genetics had been refined over thousands of years to produce perfect killing machines. They possessed strength that could crush stone, and speed that could catch lightning, and scales that could deflect blades, but evolution had not prepared them for this. Their bodies were designed for explosive bursts of violence, and they were meant to end fights quickly and decisively. No Crovar had ever needed to sustain combat for more than a few minutes in the observation box. A Crovar general watched with growing horror as his people's champion faltered. He turned to his aide and demanded to know what was happening to Thorax. The aide had no answer. Across the arena in the human section, Doan was explaining to anyone who would listen. He said, humans evolved on a world where the dominant hunting strategy was persistence, predation. Ancient humans would identify prey and then simply follow it across vast distances. They would walk and jog and run for hours and days until the prey animal collapsed from exhaustion. Every other predator on Earth relied on ambush or speed or overwhelming force. Only humans relied on endurance. Only humans could keep going when everything else had stopped. De Silori, Cadet nearby, asked how that was possible and how any creature could run for days without rest. Dawn explained that humans had developed unique biological adaptations. They could sweat to regulate temperature. While other animals overheated, they had tendons that stored and released energy efficiently. They had slow-twitch muscle fibers that resisted fatigue, and most importantly, they had a mental capacity to push through pain and exhaustion that no other species could match. The Solari looked at the arena where Yuna continued to move despite her obvious injuries, and he began to understand. On the arena floor, Thorax launched another attack, and it was slow and predictable, and Yuna sidestepped it easily. He stumbled past her and nearly fell, and had to catch himself on his hands and knees. The crowd gasped. 20 minutes had passed, and the champion was on all fours, gasping for breath. Yuna stood over him, and she could have attacked, but she did not. She waited. Thorax pushed himself up with tremendous effort and turned to face her. His eyes were wild with confusion and desperation, and something that looked almost like madness. He had never experienced failure, and he did not know how to process what was happening. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper and asked what she was. Yuna answered him simply. She said she was human, and that this was what humans did. She said they endured, and they survived, and they refused to stop, no matter what stood against them. Thorax roared with the last of his strength and charged at her. It was a final desperate attempt to end the match through sheer force of will. Yuna braced herself, and this time she did not evade. She could not keep dodging forever, and her own reserves were nearly depleted. Champion's fist connected with her shoulder, and the impact sent her spinning across the arena floor. She hit the ground hard, and the crowd surged to its feet, expecting the match to finally end. But Yuna pushed herself up. Her left arm hung limp at her side, and the pain was extraordinary, but she got to her feet. Thorax stared at her with incomprehension. He had hit her with everything he had left, and she had simply stood back up. He tried to advance, and his legs would not cooperate. He took one step and then another, and then he collapsed. The mighty Crovar champion fell face first onto the arena floor and could not rise. The officiator began the count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd held its breath. 4-5 Ithercrack struggled and managed to get one arm beneath himself. 6-7. He pushed with everything he had and got to his knees. 8. He tried to stand, and his legs buckled. 9. Fell back to the floor. 10. The officiator raised his staff and declared the match over. Winner by exhaustion of opponent was Cadet Yuna Park of Earth. For a long moment nobody moved and nobody spoke, and nobody seemed able to process what they had witnessed. Then Ambassador Choi stood in the observation box and began to applaud. Slowly others joined her. Applause spread through the arena like fire, and within moments 15,000 voices were cheering for the tiny human who had done the impossible. Yuna walked to where Thorax lay, and she knelt beside him. She placed her good hand on his shoulder and spoke quietly, so only he could hear. She said he was a great warrior, and that his strength and speed were beyond anything she could ever match. She said that in any fair fight he would have destroyed her, but this was not about strength or speed. This was about refusing to stop. Thorax looked up at her, and the confusion in his eyes had transformed into something else. It was the beginning of respect. Asked her how she kept going when her body should have failed. Yuna smiled despite her pain and said that humans had a saying. They said it was not about how hard you could hit, but about how hard you could get hit and keep moving forward. She offered him her hand and helped him sit up. The crowd was still cheering, and the sound washed over them both. Thorax looked at the human who had defeated him, and he finally understood what made these small, soft creatures so dangerous. They simply refused to quit no matter the odds and no matter the pain, and no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. Humans just kept going, and that made them the most terrifying species in the galaxy. The Grand Combat Arena of Varantos Prime could hold 15,000 spectators, and every seat was filled. Representatives from 47 species had come to watch the tournament, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation and barely concealed amusement. The first match of the day promised to be quick entertainment when Thorax Velkan entered the arena. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. He strode through the competitor gate with the confidence of a predator entering his hunting ground, and his ceremonial armor gleamed under the arena lights, and his scales rippled with barely contained power. He raised his arms and roared, and 15,000 voices roared back in appreciation. This was a champion, and everyone knew it then. Unipark walked through the opposite gate, and the applause transformed into laughter. She wore standard training gear with no ceremonial decoration, and she stood barely 1.5 meters tall, and she weighed perhaps 50 kilograms against the massive Crover champion. She looked like a child facing a monster in the diplomatic observation box. Ambassador Choi Sunny gripped the armrests of her chair and tried to keep her face neutral. Beside her, a Vellani diplomat leaned over and said he hoped the human understood this would be quick because he had wagers on other matches he wanted to see. The ambassador did not respond on the arena floor. Yuna walked to her starting position and bowed to the officiator with perfect form. She did not acknowledge the crowd or the laughter or the thousands of eyes watching her with contempt. She simply took her stance and waited. Thorax studied her from across the arena, and his expression showed something between confusion and disappointment. Had hoped for a worthy opponent to open his tournament run, and instead he had been given this tiny creature. The officiator stepped forward and announced the match rules, and both competitors acknowledged them. Standard combat rules would apply, and the match would end when one fighter could not continue or when one fighter surrendered. There would be no time limit. The officiator raised his staff, and the arena fell silent, brought the staff down, and shouted for the match to begin. Thorax exploded forward with speed that seemed impossible for his massive frame. His opening strike was legendary and had ended 14 of his previous matches within the first 3 seconds, and it came now with all the force and precision that had made him champion. Yuna was not there. She had moved the instant he committed to the attack, and she was 3 meters to the left. When his fist passed through the space where she had been standing, the crowd murmured in surprise. Thorax recovered instantly and launched a spinning backhand that would have taken her head from her shoulders. Again, she was not there. She moved constantly and never in straight lines and never where he expected. Champion pressed his assault with combinations that would have overwhelmed any normal opponent, and he drove her across the arena with relentless aggression. But he could not touch her. 30 seconds passed, and then 1 minute, and the crowd grew quiet. This was not how the champions' matches went. Thorax stepped back and reassessed, and Yuna circled to his left, keeping distance between them. He lunged again with a technique he had never needed to use before, and it was a feint designed to draw her into a trap. Yuna did not take the bait and simply moved away. Champion's eyes narrowed, and he began to understand that this human was not fighting like any opponent he had faced. She was not trying to attack him at all. 2 minutes passed, and the arena was completely silent. Now in the stands, Dohwan gripped Myra's arm and whispered that it was working. Myra shook her head and said she could not believe what she was seeing. Thorax launched another assault, and this time it was fueled by frustration, and his strikes came faster and harder, and he pushed his body to deliver maximum violence. Still, Yuna evaded and dodged and refused to engage. She never struck back, and she never attempted to counter, and she simply would not stop moving. The champion was breathing harder now, and nobody in the arena had ever seen that before. 3 minutes passed, and then 4, and then 5. Thorax's attacks began to slow by fractions that only trained eyes could detect. His feet were not quite as quick, and his combinations were not quite as crisp, and the explosive power that defined his fighting style was beginning to fade. In the observation box, the Vellani diplomat had stopped laughing and was leaning forward with intense concentration. Ambassador Choi had tears forming in her eyes on the arena floor. Yuna continued to move, and her breathing was controlled and steady, and her eyes never left the champion. She was tired and her legs burned, and every evasion required effort that was draining her reserves. But she had trained for this. She had prepared her body for exactly this. Scenario 6 minutes passed, and Thorax stood in the center of the arena with his chest heaving and his arms feeling heavy in ways he had never experienced. He stared at the human who circled him like a ghost, and he could not understand what was happening to him. He had never felt this way before. His muscles burned, and his lungs demanded more air than he could provide, and his reactions had slowed by measurable degrees. Suna spoke for the first time in the match, and her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent arena. She asked him if he felt it now. Thorax did not answer, but his eyes showed confusion and the first hints of something that might have been fear. Yuna continued speaking and said that the burning in his muscles and the weight in his arms and the fire in his lungs had a name. Humans called it fatigue. The champion roared and charged at her with desperate fury and threw everything he had into one final overwhelming assault. Yuna weathered it, and she was hit twice, and each blow sent her staggering and left bruises that would last for weeks. But she stayed on her feet, and she kept moving, and she did not fall. 8 minutes passed, and Thorax dropped to one knee for the first time in his entire career. The arena erupted, not in cheers but in shocked gasps. The undefeated Crowbar champion was kneeling on the arena floor, and the tiny human was still standing. Yuna circled him, and she was hurt and bleeding from a cut above her eye, and every part of her body screamed for rest. But she was still standing. She looked down at the kneeling champion and said that on Earth humans used to hunt by running after their prey for days without stopping. She said that every predator and every prey animal on their world would eventually collapse from exhaustion, but humans just kept going. Thorax looked up at her, and for the first time in his life, he faced an opponent he did not know how to defeat. He struggled to rise and managed to get to his feet, and he launched another attack, but now his strikes were slow and clumsy, and Yuna dodged them easily. 10 minutes passed, and the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. They were watching the fall of a legend and the rise of something new. They were watching a human do what no one believed was possible, and they could not look away. 2 days before the tournament, the betting pools opened across the station, and the odds against Yuna Park were the highest ever recorded in Academy history. One Villani merchant offered 10,000 to 1 against a human, and within hours, he had accepted wagers from nearly every species on board. No one bet on Yuna. The main training hall, the other tournament competitors practiced their techniques under the watchful eyes of Academy instructors. Akrov warriors sparred with brutal efficiency, while Tarathi grapplers drilled their submission holds, and Meridian fighters danced through complex blade forms. Suna was not among them. She had reserved a small private training room on the lower deck, and she spent her hours there alone doing exercises that confused anyone who happened to observe through the window. She stretched for long periods, and she practiced breathing techniques, and she moved through slow, controlled motions that seemed to have no combat application. A group of Cellori cadets gathered outside the window and watched her with forearm gestures of confusion. One of them remarked that the human was not even trying, and that she had clearly accepted her defeat already. Another suggested she was simply too stupid to know how to fight properly. They laughed and moved on inside the training room. Yuna continued her work without acknowledging their presence. She had studied the Crowbar anatomy in detail, and she knew exactly where their nerve clusters were located and where their joints were most vulnerable and where sustained pressure would cause maximum effect. She practiced striking these points over and over until her hands could find them without conscious thought. In the evening, she ran again. This time her squad mates joined her on the track, and they pushed themselves to keep up with her steady pace. After 30 minutes, Dohan was gasping for breath and had to stop. After 45 minutes, Mira dropped out with cramps in her legs. After an hour, Taiwan collapsed on the track surface and could not continue. Aina ran for another hour alone. When she finally stopped, she was breathing hard, but her eyes were clear and focused. Her squad mates looked at her with new understanding. Tuan told her he had researched persistence predators, like she suggested, and he had learned that ancient humans used to hunt by chasing animals until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. Yuna nodded and said their ancestors could run for days without stopping, and that no prey could escape them, because eventually everything got tired except humans. Myra asked if that was really her plan, and if she intended to just run away from Thorax until he got tired. Yuna said she did not plan to run away, and that she planned to survive. And there was a difference. Atan asked how long she thought she could last against. Yuna looked at the track stretching around the station and said she could last as long as she needed to last, because that was what humans did the next day. Thorax. Velkan approached her directly. She was eating alone in the mess hall when his massive shadow fell across her table, and she looked up to find the champion standing over her. Entire hall fell silent watching Thorax spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room and said he wished to offer her an honorable way out. Yuna asked what he meant. Champion explained that he had killed 17 opponents in sanctioned combat, and that he took no pleasure in destroying those weaker than himself, and that if she withdrew now he would speak no word against her and her honor would remain intact. Yuna considered his words and then asked him a question. She asked if he had ever lost a match. Thorax's eyes narrowed, and he said he had never lost and would never lose, because he was the greatest warrior the Krovar had produced in 3 generations. Sayana nodded and asked another question. She asked if he had ever been tired during a fight. The champion seemed confused by this and said his matches never lasted long enough for fatigue to be a factor. Yuna stood, and though she barely reached his chest, she looked up at him without fear. She thanked him for his concern and said she would see him in the arena tomorrow. Then she walked past him and left the hall. Thorax watched her go, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been curiosity. That evening, Instructor Valis Tan summoned Yuna to her office. The Solari combat master was ancient by her species standards, and her forearms bore the marks of countless battles, and she had trained warriors for longer than humanity had possessed spaceflight. She gestured for Yuna to sit and studied her with compound eyes that missed nothing. The instructor said she had been watching Yuna's training, and she had noticed that Yuna was not preparing like the other competitors. Sayana acknowledged this was true. Valis leaned forward and asked what Yuna's strategy was against an opponent she could not possibly overpower. Yuna was silent for a moment, and then she asked the instructor a question. She asked what happened when a Krovar warrior could no longer continue fighting. Valis said it had never happened in her lifetime, because Krovar were bred for combat, and their bodies were engines of destruction that never failed. Yuna said everything failed eventually, and that every body had limits, and that the only question was who reached their limits first. The instructor considered this, and then made a gesture of acknowledgement. With her upper arm, she told Yuna that she was either very wise or very foolish, and that tomorrow would reveal which. Yuna thanked her and returned to her quarters. That night she lay in bed and allowed herself to feel afraid. The fear was real and present, and she did not try to push it away. She would face a warrior who had killed 17 opponents and who could end her life with a single blow, and every logical analysis suggested she would lose. But logic did not account for everything. Logic did not account for 10,000 years of human evolution. Logic did not account for ancestors who chased mammoths across frozen plains for days without rest. Logic did not account for the stubborn, impossible human refusal to give up. She breathed slowly and let the fear pass through her, and then she slept on the morning of the tournament. She woke before dawn and ate a large breakfast and drank plenty of water and stretched her muscles until they were warm and loose. Her squad mates came to her quarters and they stood with her in silence, because there were no words adequate for this moment. One finally spoke and said they would be in the stands watching, and that whatever happened today, they were proud to serve alongside her. Myra said humanity had sent them to this academy to prove they belonged, and that win or lose, Yuna had already proven it just by refusing to back down. Taewon simply clasped her shoulder and nodded. Yuna thanked them and told them to watch carefully because today they were going to show the galaxy something it had never seen. She made her way to the arena entrance and waited in the competitor staging area. Through the walls she could hear the roar of thousands of spectators, and she could feel the vibration of their excitement. A tournament official approached and told her it was almost time and asked if she was ready. Yuna rolled her shoulders and took a deep breath and said she was ready. The official looked at her with something that might have been pity, and then the doors began to open. Bright lights flooded through, and the crowd noise became deafening. Yuna Park walked forward into the arena to face the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy. She was terrified, and she was ready, and she was human. Then would have to be enough. The announcement came during the evening meal, and every cadet in the mess hall heard it clearly through the station speakers. Cadet Yuna Park of Earth would face champion Thorax Volcan of the Krovar Empire in the first round of the interspecies combat tournament. For a moment, there was silence, and then the laughter began. It started at the Krovar table, where a dozen massive reptilian warriors slammed their fists against the metal surface in what passed for amusement among their kind, and soon it spread to the Villani delegation and the Tarathi cadets, and even the usually stoic Meridian observers allowed themselves quiet chuckles. Yuna sat at the small human table in the corner of the hall with her 3 squad mates, and she did not look up from her meal. Do-Wan Shin leaned close to her and whispered urgently, asking if she had heard what they just announced. She nodded once and continued eating. Across the hall, the Krovar champion himself rose from his seat, and the room fell quiet. Because when Thorax Volcan stood, everyone paid attention. Towered 3 meters tall, and his scaled body was covered in the ceremonial scars of 47 victories, and his eyes burned with the confidence of a warrior who had never known defeat. He looked directly at the human table and smiled, showing rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. The tournament bracket was displayed on every screen in the mess hall, and everyone could see how perfectly the matches had been arranged so that the tiny human female would face the most dangerous fighter in the entire academy. Myra Jang pushed her food away and said this was not random and that someone had rigged this whole thing. To Beak agreed and added that they wanted to humiliate humanity and show the whole galaxy that humans did not belong here. Yuna finished her meal and stood up, and her squad mates watched her, expecting some reaction or some sign of anger or fear. She simply picked up her tray and walked to the recycling station and then headed for the exit. A massive Krovar cadet blocked her path and looked down at her with contempt, asking where the little Death Worlder thought she was going. Yuna looked up at him calmly and replied that she was going to her quarters to rest. The Krovar laughed and said she should rest well because in 3 days her champion would break every bone in her tiny body, and everyone would see how weak humans truly were. Yuna stepped around him without responding and walked out of the mess hall. Behind her, the laughter continued. The Galactic Military Academy on Varantos Prime had trained warriors from 47 member species for over 1,000 years, and in all that time only 4 humans had ever walked its halls. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord just 2 years ago, and their membership was still probationary, and many species believed humans had no business being part of the alliance at all. They were too small and too soft and too fragile, and they came from a world so dangerous that most species could not survive there for more than a few hours. The other species called Earth a death world, and they called humans death worlders, but they said it with mockery rather than respect, because humans had not yet proven themselves worthy of fear. The annual combat tournament was the most prestigious event at the Academy, and victory brought honor not just to the individual, but to their entire species. For 3 consecutive years, Thorax Volcan had claimed that honor for the Krovar Empire, and each victory had been swift and brutal. His Average match lasted less than 30 seconds, and his opponents often required weeks in medical recovery. Some never fully healed. Now the tournament organizers had arranged for a human to face him in the very first round, and everyone understood the message humanity would be put in its place in her small quarters. Yuna removed her uniform jacket and sat at her desk and activated her personal terminal. She pulled up the combat archives and began searching for footage of Thorax Volcand. Were dozens of recordings spanning his entire career, and she selected the first one and began to watch on the screen the massive Krovar warrior faced a Volani opponent twice. His wait in the match lasted exactly 22 seconds before the Volani lay broken on the arena floor. Yuna watched without expression and then made a note on her datapad. She selected the next recording. For hours, she sat there watching every match and studying every movement and recording every detail. She noted how Thorax opened each fight and how he positioned his feet and how he distributed his weight and how he breathed. She watched him fight Tarathi wrestlers and Meridian Blade masters and Salori martial artists, and in every match, the pattern was the same. Explosive violence followed by immediate victory, followed by celebration. Not once in any recording did a match extend beyond 40 seconds. Not once did Thorax show any sign of fatigue or strain. Not once did any opponent survive long enough to test his endurance. Yuna made a final note and closed the terminal. She understood now what she was dealing with, and more importantly, she understood what Thorax had never experienced. The next morning, she woke before the station lights simulated dawn, and she dressed in training clothes and left her quarters. Corridors were empty at this hour, and she made her way to the lower recreation deck, where a running track circled the station perimeter. She began to run. An hour passed, and then 2, and then 3. And still she ran with steady breathing and measured pace. Tarathi Cadet entered the track area and stopped in confusion, watching the human circle the track. Again and again, he had never seen anyone run for so long without purpose, and he could not understand what she was trying to accomplish. Eventually, he left, and still Yuna ran. Midday, her squad mates found her in the track area, completing what must have been her 100th lap. Doan called out to her, asking what she was doing, and telling her she should be in the combat training hall, practicing strikes and blocks. He slowed to a stop and wiped sweat from her face, and told him she was practicing exactly what she needed to practice. Myra asked how running would help her against a Krovar and pointed out that Thorax could crush her skull with one hand. Yuna took a long drink of water and then looked at her friends. She asked them if they had ever watched his matches, and they nodded because everyone had watched his matches. Then she asked them what they noticed about his opponents, and Taiwan said they all lost, and they all lost quickly. Yuna nodded and said that was exactly right, and that every single opponent tried to match his power and speed, and every single one was destroyed in seconds. Dowan asked what else she could do, because humans were not strong enough to hurt a Krovar, and they were not fast enough to match their reflexes. Yuna smiled slightly and said there was one thing humans could do that no other species in the galaxy had ever truly mastered. She turned and began running again, and over her shoulder, she told them to go research what a persistence predator was. Her squad mates watched her run, and they did not understand, but they trusted her. That night, Ambassador Choi Sunhee requested a private meeting with Yuna in the diplomatic suite. The ambassador was a distinguished woman who had spent 30 years representing Earth across the galaxy, and her face showed the weight of every difficult negotiation she offered. Yuna tea, and they sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence. Finally, the ambassador spoke and said she had to ask Yuna to consider withdrawing from the tournament. Yuna held her tea, but did not drink, and asked why she would do that. The ambassador explained that there was no shame in avoiding an unwinnable fight, and that everyone expected her to lose, and that withdrawing due to injury would preserve her dignity, and humanity would not be blamed. Set down her cup and looked at the ambassador directly. She said that with respect she would not withdraw and that she had come to this academy to prove that humans belonged here and running away would prove the opposite. The ambassador sighed and said she admired Yuna's courage, but courage alone would not stop a Crovar from killing her. Yuna stood and thanked the ambassador for her concern and said she should watch the match because she might be surprised by what humans were capable of. She left a diplomatic suite and returned to her quarters alone. In the darkness, she pulled up the combat footage one more time and watched Thorax Velkon destroy opponent after opponent. Then she closed her eyes and slept deeply and peacefully. In 3 days, she would show the galaxy what it meant to be human.